In the fall of 1863, the quiet Kentucky town of Millfield saw 17 military marriages and 16 funerals in just 8 months. But what made the numbers haunting was that 15 of those dead soldiers had all been married to the same woman. Her name was Constance Grimsley. By the end of the war, she had buried 7 husbands, collected their pensions, and still carried the reputation of the most devoted widow in 3 counties. Official records blamed war wounds and what doctors called battlefield fever, but unearthed correspondence decades later hinted at something darker. Letters between Union and Confederate medical officers revealed both sides had noticed the strange death rate in Millfield. Though their investigation ended abruptly when Chaplain Samuel Rutherford, the lead investigator, was found dead under suspicious circumstances. 70 years later, a discovery in Constance's attic would shatter accepted beliefs about Civil War medicine and raise the question of how many widows may have been working similar schemes. To understand how Constance thrived, one must first understand Millfield itself. In 1862, the town of fewer than 800 people sat just 15 miles from the Tennessee border, a Union stronghold surrounded by Confederate sympathizers. Its location made it a critical supply route, transforming the town into a medical hub. The Methodist Church became a hospital and homes open to the wounded. Into this turmoil walked Constance, arriving with nothing more than a carpet bag and a glowing letter of introduction from a Louisville minister praising her devotion. Striking at 28 with auburn hair and a face described as both beautiful and filled with Christian sympathy, she quickly won the town's trust. She claimed a tragic past, daughter of a physician lost to cholera caretaker, to a dying mother, and fiancée to a Union officer killed at Bull Run. She said she could no longer bear children, but felt compelled to comfort dying soldiers. To Millfield, she was an angel. What they didn't know was hidden in the false bottom of her carpet bag, a small leather journal filled with precise notes on plants, doses, and symptoms. What looked like harmless remedies were in fact experiments in poisons. Constance's timing was perfect. The Battle of Shiloh had flooded Millfield with the wounded, and Dr. Patterson gratefully accepted her help. Within weeks, her reputation soared, and soldiers under her care found peace where others had suffered. She became the most trusted healer in the county, her story of tragic love shielding her true intent, the systematic exploitation of war grief and trust for a deadly purpose. On a humid June evening in 1862, Private Thomas Kellerman of the 5th Kentucky Infantry became Constance Grimsley's first husband in Millfield. The ceremony took place in the town's converted Methodist church, with Dr. Patterson serving as witness and Mrs. Hartwell calling it the most romantic wartime wedding she had ever seen. Thomas, a farmer's son from eastern Kentucky, had been left crippled after shrapnel tore into his leg during a skirmish near Bowling Green. The wound, infected from travel, threatened amputation and made him reliant on others for care. When Constance volunteered to nurse him privately, the arrangement seemed both practical and blessed by Providence. Their courtship lasted just 3 weeks. Grateful for her devotion and believing he had found a kindred spirit, Thomas proposed one evening as she tended his wounds by lamplight. Constance accepted with what appeared to be genuine tears, insisting on an immediate marriage before his regiment moved on. "If God grants us only a short time together, let us at least have the blessing of marriage," she told Mrs. Hartwell. On June 18th, Thomas hobbled to the altar on crude crutches, while Constance, radiant in a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, pledged her vows. Dr. Patterson noted in his journal that the groom looked pale and complained of stomach pains, but dismissed it as nerves. 4 days later, on the morning of June 22nd, Mrs. Hartwell found Constance weeping over her husband's body. Thomas had died during the night, seemingly from acute gastric fever linked to his infected leg. His last hours were marked by violent cramps, feverish sweating, and delirious warnings about bitter medicine and the woman with poison hands. Dr. Patterson, overwhelmed with patience and convinced by Constance's grief, made only a cursory examination. He overlooked the puncture wounds on Thomas's arms that suggested injections, and he never questioned the small vial of clear liquid Constance quietly removed from beneath the mattress. The town, moved by her loss, rallied around her. A collection was taken up, and soon after news arrived that Thomas's military pension would be paid to his widow. Constance used the money to purchase a modest house on Elm Street, telling neighbors she needed privacy to mourn. She also invested in medical supplies, herbs, tinctures, and glass vessels she claimed would aid her care for wounded soldiers. Before long, the house became known as a refuge for the most hopeless cases, a place where broken men found comfort in her attentive hands. It was also where she married 6 more soldiers, each union ending with the same tragic pattern: a soldier in her care, a whirlwind courtship, a hasty wedding, and sudden death within days. By winter of 1862, she had buried Corporal James Dunleavy of the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry Sergeant, William Brennan of the 9th Ohio Infantry, and Private Henry Culper, a Confederate deserter given sanctuary for his information. Each death was attributed to lingering war wounds, and each left Constance wealthier and more firmly entrenched in the community. Though Dr. Patterson began to notice the unsettling repetition, his suspicions were dulled by grief-stricken performances so convincing that few in Millfield dared question the woman they now regarded as both healer and saint. Constance Grimsley always chose the most gravely wounded soldiers, the men Dr. Patterson had already resigned to losing. To the people of Millfield, her willingness to nurse them through their final days looked like selfless Christian devotion. If they died despite her tireless care, well, that was the cruel reality of war. The town adored her for it. The local paper published a glowing profile calling her our angel of mercy. Church women delivered casseroles to her door and competed for the privilege of comforting her during her periods of mourning. Veterans who recovered under her hand swore she had saved them, though none of them had been so sick or so conveniently married as the men who died. The military, scattered and disorganized, was slower to notice. A Union corporal's death in July had no obvious connection to a Confederate deserter's death in September. Not when each case was certified by the town's physician and attributed to lingering wounds. But by the winter of 1862, one man had started to piece things together: Chaplain Samuel Rutherford. Rutherford was just 26, a Princeton seminary graduate who had volunteered to serve Union forces out of religious duty. Intelligent and observant, he noticed details others overlooked. His suspicions began when he administered last rites to Sergeant William Brennan. In his final confession, Brennan muttered troubling things about his wife's medicine, suggesting he was being hurried along to heaven. At first, Rutherford dismissed the words as fevered delirium. But when 2 months later, Confederate deserter Henry Culper whispered nearly identical fears, the chaplain started keeping quiet notes. The pattern he uncovered chilled him. The soldiers dying in Constance's care weren't the worst off. They were often those with the strongest chances of recovery. Yet each death followed the same course: severe stomach pain, feverish sweats, and bouts of delirium not linked to their original wounds. On New Year's Eve, 1862, Rutherford's doubts hardened into certainty. He was summoned to the bedside of Private Daniel Hawthorne, Constance's 4th husband, who had only a shoulder wound. The injury should not have been fatal, but under her care he declined swiftly, showing the same symptoms as the others. As Rutherford leaned in to deliver the last rites, Hawthorne seized his wrist and rasped words that would echo in the chaplain's mind forever. "She's killing us, Padre. The medicine burns like hellfire. She's killing us for the money, and she won't stop until someone makes her." Less than an hour later, Hawthorne was dead. His certificate, like the others, cited battlefield complications. Rutherford knew then that he was facing something monstrous. He began a quiet investigation, fully aware of the risks. Constance was revered as a saint in Millfield, and any accusation would demand undeniable proof. Worse, if she had killed 4 men already, she was capable of killing again, perhaps even him. His inquiries reached beyond Millfield. Searching through military records, Rutherford uncovered unsettling parallels in other Kentucky towns. In 3 separate communities, war widows had married multiple soldiers who later died inheriting their pensions after deaths officially ruled as complications from wounds. Each widow claimed medical training, each carried letters of introduction from distant ministers, and each appeared in town at the war's outbreak. Even more disturbing, all had been reported purchasing unusual quantities of certain herbs and chemicals from local apothecaries. Armed with these discoveries, Rutherford expanded his investigation, traveling quietly to nearby towns and questioning apothecaries about unusual sales. What he was beginning to assemble was a pattern of death that reached far beyond Millfield, one that hinted at a hidden network of women exploiting war grief and trust in ways no one dared imagine. What Rutherford uncovered left him shaken. In Lebanon, a druggist recalled selling large amounts of white arsenic to a woman who fit Constance's description, claiming it was needed to combat rats in the hospital. In Springfield, a pharmacist admitted selling her heavy quantities of antimonies, safe in small doses, but fatal in larger ones. Most unsettling was the account of Granny Fletcher, an elderly herb woman from the hills near Millfield. She remembered Constance approaching her months earlier, asking for plants that could mimic battlefield fever and ease soldiers peacefully into death. Suspicious of her intent, Granny Fletcher had refused, but the request lingered in her memory. While Rutherford pieced together this damning trail, Constance was already planning her 5th marriage. Her next target was Lieutenant Marcus Sheffield, a Union cavalry officer with a bullet wound to the thigh. Though the injury was healing well under Dr. Patterson's care, Constance convinced the doctor that Sheffield's mind, not his body, was in jeopardy. She claimed he suffered from terrible nightmares and needed the kind of private attention only she could provide. Sheffield, plagued by what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, found solace in her company. She listened as he relived the horrors of combat, soothing him with sympathy and quiet devotion. Predictably, within weeks, he was declaring his love, and by February, he had proposed. Constance, weeping with apparent joy, insisted they marry at once. The wedding was set for Valentine's Day, 1863, but Rutherford had resolved that Sheffield would not share the fate of the others. On February 10th, just 4 days before the ceremony, he requested a clandestine meeting with Colonel Matthew Harrison, the Union commander in the region. The gathering took place in the back room of Millfield's only hotel, with Dr. Patterson present at the colonel's insistence. Rutherford laid out his case with precision. He described the pattern of rapid courtships followed by sudden deaths. The recurring symptoms, inconsistent with the soldiers' wounds, the suspicious purchases of arsenic and antimony, and the dying words of men who claimed they were poisoned. Colonel Harrison listened with increasing unease, but Dr. Patterson resisted. "Samuel," he said gravely, "you're making grave accusations against a woman who has shown nothing but Christian charity." These men were grievously wounded. Their deaths, while tragic, were not unexpected. Rutherford said nothing at first. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced a small vial he had retrieved from under the mattress, where Private Hawthorne had spent his final hours. He set it on the table. "Then explain this," he said. The room fell silent. For the first time, Colonel Harrison and Dr. Patterson were forced to consider the unthinkable that Millfield's beloved angel of mercy might in fact be a predator cloaked in sympathy, and that every day of inaction risked another soldier's life. Rutherford's evidence was damning, but the vial sealed it. "I found this hidden beneath the mattress after his death," he explained, placing it before Colonel Harrison and Dr. Patterson. A chemist in Louisville confirmed it contained antimony sulfide mixed with arsenic oxide. In small doses, it causes sweating and stomach pain symptoms that mimic battlefield fever. In larger doses, it brings convulsions and delirium, ending in death. Dr. Patterson, hands trembling, examined the vial. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Sewn into a cloth pocket inside the straw mattress," Rutherford replied. There were needle marks on the cloth. She used it to conceal and administer the poison. Colonel Harrison made his decision at once. "We search her house before the wedding. If we find more, she'll be arrested under military authority. But this must be done quietly. If she learns of it, she'll flee or, worse, destroy the evidence." The search was set for dawn on February 13th, while Constance busied herself with final preparations at the church. The small team, Harrison, Rutherford, Dr. Patterson, and Sergeant Major O'Brien, an experienced investigator, entered her Elm Street home, with a key reluctantly provided by Mrs. Hartwell. At first, everything seemed in order. Shelves of medical supplies, religious texts, mourning portraits of dead husbands, and grateful letters from soldiers she had nursed. But in her back bedroom, hidden behind a loose board, they found the truth. The first discovery was the leather journal Rutherford had long suspected existed. Its pages contained meticulous records, not of healing, but of controlled experiments. Each entry began with a subject's name, physical condition, and regiment, followed by precise notes on dosages, symptoms, and outcomes. Subject responds to antimony sulfide within 6 hours, gastric distress, and profuse sweating. Increased dosage tomorrow to accelerate decline. Another read arsenic oxide, more reliable for final treatment. Subject expired within 48 hours, symptoms consistent with battlefield fever. No suspicion from attending physician. Dr. Patterson grew pale as he recognized his own medical notes cited alongside her poisons. She had been timing her doses to align with his diagnoses, ensuring her crimes looked natural. The journal's early entries were even more disturbing. Before Millfield, she had practiced on strays, cats, and dogs, and later elderly patients in Louisville, refining her methods long before the war offered her a larger stage. Elsewhere in the house, O'Brien uncovered vials of deadly compounds, disguised with harmless labels like stomach soother and headache powder. Hidden in a flour canister were syringes bearing signs of recent use. In her dresser lay trophies of her victims, wedding rings, pocket watches, and forged documents prepared to claim multiple pensions across different regiments. But Rutherford's discovery was the most chilling. Beneath her bed, inside a small wooden box, he found correspondence revealing Constance was not acting alone. Letters from women in Tennessee, Virginia, and beyond outlined a coordinated network of war widows preying on soldiers. One signed by Margaret boasted, "The antimony works perfectly when mixed with real medicine." The men ask for it, believing it eases pain. They expire 3 days after the wedding, long enough to secure the record, short enough to avoid suspicion. Another from Elizabeth in Virginia was blunt, "Always choose men without family." No one asks questions, and pensions process quickly without competing claims. The 4 men in that room realized the implications at once. This was not the story of a single murderous widow. It was the shadow of a conspiracy stretching across the South, one that may already have claimed dozens of lives under the guise of Christian charity. Colonel Harrison acted swiftly, dispatching urgent messages to authorities in Tennessee, Virginia, and other states. The so-called Angels of Mercy were not just a rumor. They were an organized network of killers exploiting the chaos of war for profit and survival. And thanks to Constance Grimsley's arrogance, their secret had finally begun to unravel. As dawn broke over Millfield, the plan had been simple: arrest Constance the moment she returned from the church. But when the search team prepared to leave her house, they saw her outside on Elm Street speaking with Mrs. Hartwell. Even at a distance, it was obvious she had noticed the disturbance inside. She locked eyes on the house, then turned abruptly and walked quickly past the church, a small bag clutched in her hand toward the woods near the cemetery. Her stride was too urgent for casual business. "She knows," Colonel Harrison muttered. He gave his orders immediately. Sergeant Major O'Brien and 2 men would circle through the cemetery while Rutherford and Dr. Patterson advanced along the main road. She cannot escape justice, and she cannot be allowed to warn her network. Snow had begun to fall, making her trail both easier to follow and more urgent. The men fanned out through the trees, searching for signs of her path. Yet Constance had not fled into the wilderness at all. With calculated cunning, she circled back toward the church. She wasn't running, she was preparing to strike one last time. Her target was Lieutenant Marcus Sheffield, waiting inside for their wedding rehearsal, oblivious to the danger. It was Chaplain Rutherford who realized the truth first. Breathless from the chase, he told Colonel Harrison, "The church, she's gone back for Sheffield. She won't give up her final prize." The men sprinted through the snow-choked streets, their boots pounding against the frozen ground. They threw open the church doors and froze at the sight inside. Lieutenant Sheffield slumped in the front pew, his head bent at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide but dimming fast. Foam flecked his lips, and his trembling hands clawed at his throat. Standing over him, radiant in her wedding gown, Constance Grimsley held an empty syringe still dripping with poison. She turned calmly to the men who had burst in her voice, soft, almost soothing. "You're too late, gentlemen. Marcus has just received his final medicine. He'll be at peace within the hour." Dr. Patterson rushed forward, checking Sheffield's pulse and pupils, his face pale with dread. "What did you give him?" "Mercury chloride mixed with antimony," Constance replied in the same gentle tone she had used to comfort dying men. "It works quickly, though, messier than my usual mixtures. I save it for special occasions." Colonel Harrison drew his revolver, keeping the barrel low. "Constance Grimsley, by the authority of the United States Army, you are under arrest for the murder of Union soldiers and conspiracy to defraud the federal government." She laughed, the sound light and almost musical, but more terrifying than a scream. "Murder, I prefer to think of it as mercy. These boys were dying anyway. I simply helped them along while ensuring their sacrifice provided for someone who truly needed the money." "Tell me, Colonel, is that so different from what doctors do every day?" Rutherford's voice shook with fury. "You killed healthy men. Sheffield's wound was healing. He would have lived a full life. Would he?" Constance countered sharply. "Have you seen what war does to men's minds? Chaplain, they survive their wounds only to live haunted by nightmares, unable to keep work, drowning themselves in drink to forget. I've spared them that misery. I've given them peace." Her words hung in the air like poison itself, a twisted justification for a trail of bodies that had already shocked the town and would soon shake the entire Union command. "I gave them peace," Constance said evenly, watching Sheffield's body convulse as Dr. Patterson fought desperately to save him. "And I gave their widows security. Everyone benefited." Her words were disturbingly calm, as though she were explaining a household chore rather than confessing to murder. Sheffield's death was slow, but inevitable. The poison had been too precise, too perfectly measured. As his breathing faltered, Constance's tone shifted into something almost conversational. "There's something else you should know. The network you've stumbled upon, it's larger than you realize. Dozens of us from Virginia to Texas. We send letters through churches and post offices written in codes no one else could decipher. Some of the others have been at this since the war began, and their methods make mine look crude." She withdrew a folded paper from her dress and handed it over. This arrived just yesterday from Nashville. My colleague there already has 7 men marked. By next month, she'll be 7 times a widow and several $100s richer. Colonel Harrison tore the letter from her hands, scanning its chilling contents, lists of soldiers' coded phrases, instructions for pension fraud, and names of contacts across multiple states. "Why tell us this?" he demanded. Constance smiled, the mask of saintly charity falling away, to reveal something far colder. "Because you'll never catch them all. The network is too large, too careful, too necessary. Even if you hang me, others will go on. The war breeds desperate women and dying men. It's a perfect marketplace." She cast a glance around the church, her voice dripping with mockery. "And tell me, gentlemen, who will believe you? Who will dare to claim that America's sweethearts, the grieving widows who nurse our soldiers, are actually predators? The public will never accept it. You'll be the villains for persecuting women in mourning." Sheffield gave one final shudder and fell still. Constance, shackled moments later by Colonel Harrison, looked more triumphant than defeated. She had managed to poison her last groom in front of them all, and she knew her words carried a poisonous truth of their own. Her trial opened in Louisville on April 15th, 1863, exactly a month after her arrest. Despite her confidence that the public would never believe the charges, the evidence was irrefutable. The leather journal, the vials of poison, the forged pension papers, and the letters linking her to a network of killers left no room for doubt. Witnesses painted a damning picture. Rutherford described the whispered confessions of dying men. Patterson, under oath, admitted his failure to question her reports or perform thorough examinations, a negligence that made him an unwitting accomplice. Granny Fletcher, the old herb woman, recounted how Constance had asked for plants that could mimic battlefield fever, a request so sinister she had warned others in her trade to be cautious. The scope of the conspiracy stunned the courtroom. Constance's network was real. Arrests in 6 other states followed, uncovering a ring of war widows who had claimed more than 40 lives across both Union and Confederate lines. They targeted soldiers who were alone in the world, men whose deaths would leave no family to press for answers. They chose moments of chaos after battles when record-keeping was sloppy and bribed corrupt clerks to rush their pension claims through. Using aliases, moving from town to town, and refining their poisons through coded correspondence, they had built a system of predation as organized as any spy ring. The defense tried to paint Constance as a grieving woman, broken by the death of her fiancé at Bull Run, suggesting her actions were misguided mercy, not murder. But her meticulous notes, financial ledgers, and correspondence betrayed her true motives. Profit and power cloaked in piety. By the end of the trial, even hardened veterans in the gallery sat pale-faced, unable to reconcile the image of a delicate widow with the reality of a methodical killer. Constance Grimsley had not just poisoned soldiers, she had poisoned the trust of an entire community, exploiting compassion itself as her most lethal weapon. On June 18, 1863, exactly 1 year to the day after her first marriage in Millfield, Constance Grimsley was convicted on 7 counts of murder and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The military tribunal sentenced her to death by hanging, making her one of the few women in American history executed for war crimes during the Civil War. Her execution took place on July 4, 1863. A date chosen as much for symbolism as for convenience. Before the noose was placed around her neck, Constance gave her final words. They offered neither remorse nor apology, only a cold justification. "I regret that my methods were discovered," she said. "But I do not regret providing peace to men who would have suffered far more if left to live with their wounds and their memories. History will judge whether my mercy was more cruel than your justice." With that, the trapdoor fell and the so-called Angel of Mercy met her end. The broader investigation into the widow network stretched through 1863 and 1864. 16 women were ultimately identified as part of the conspiracy, though only half were caught and brought to trial. The rest vanished into the chaos of wartime America, almost certainly continuing their operations under new names. Even more chilling documents found among Constance's letters suggested that this scheme was not unique to the Civil War. Similar groups may have operated during the Mexican-American War and perhaps earlier conflicts, hinting at a dark, unacknowledged pattern in American military history: the systematic exploitation of wounded soldiers by women posing as caregivers. The impact on Millfield was devastating. Dr. Patterson, haunted by his failure to see the truth, and by the way Constance had used his own diagnoses to mask her crimes, abandoned medicine altogether and moved west. Mrs. Hartwell shuttered her boarding house and went to live with family in Ohio, claiming she could not bear to remain in a home where so much plotting had occurred. The Methodist church where 5 of Constance's weddings had been performed and where Sheffield had died was abandoned by its congregation. Locals deemed it too stained by evil to serve as a house of worship, and in later years they whispered of strange sounds coming from the derelict building at night. Lieutenant Marcus Sheffield was laid to rest in Millfield's military cemetery with full honors. His headstone bore no mention of the manner of his death. Authorities believed that publicizing it would only deepen grief and erode confidence in the system meant to care for wounded men. As for the pensions Constance had collected, the government never managed to recover the bulk of the money. Investigators estimated she had stolen more than $3,000, a staggering fortune at the time, equal to several years' wages for an average American. Constance Grimsley was gone, but her crimes cast a long shadow. She had exposed a hidden vulnerability in wartime society, where compassion could be twisted into a weapon and grief turned into profit. Her execution closed one chapter, but the lingering question remained: how many others like her had walked away undetected, leaving only graves and silence behind? Some of Constance Grimsley's stolen pension money was recovered, hidden in her Elm Street house, but most of it had already been funneled to other members of the conspiracy or invested in supplies for future operations. The revelation that her network might have been only one small branch of a much larger system was deeply unsettling. The Civil War, with its unprecedented casualty rates and chaotic medical conditions, had created fertile ground for predators who cloaked themselves in charity. In the aftermath, military authorities rushed to impose reforms. New regulations required multiple physicians to sign off on every soldier's death and ordered thorough reviews of all fatalities under private nursing care. Yet for the men already lost, and for the communities that had unknowingly harbored murderers disguised as widows, these changes came far too late. The story of Constance Grimsley became a grim lesson about the dangers of blind trust and the ease with which desperation and grief could be exploited during times of crisis. The case was so disturbing that the War Department sealed its records for nearly 6 decades. When the files were finally opened in the 1920s, historians uncovered details too horrific to have been made public during the war itself. Some women in the conspiracy had gone beyond soldiers, targeting elderly civilians, and even children, collecting inheritance money and life insurance payments through the same calculated poisonings. Modern forensic studies of the preserved evidence have confirmed that Constance's methods were chillingly advanced for her era. Her poison combinations, arsenic, antimony, and mercury, were chosen with scientific precision to mimic battlefield diseases. Her timing was deliberate, avoiding obvious patterns and ensuring her victims' deaths could be written off as natural consequences of war injuries. The scandal also exposed deep flaws in military record-keeping. Pension clerks, overwhelmed by the flood of claims, often relied on local officials who could be bribed or deceived. This loophole allowed fraudulent claims to pass unchecked. The reforms that followed the Grimsley case laid the groundwork for modern systems of military benefits and stricter verification procedures. But those reforms were purchased at the cost of dozens of lives. Today, Constance's legacy lingers in Millfield. The house on Elm Street still stands, though its history makes it difficult to sell. Its current owners have transformed it into a small museum of Civil War medicine, carefully avoiding mention of the woman who once lived and killed there. The old Methodist church where Lieutenant Sheffield died was demolished in 1895, but the cemetery remains. The graves of Constance's victims lie in a quiet cluster, their headstones giving only names and dates silent about the horrors that ended their lives. Visitors sometimes note the arrangement of the graves, a rough circle surrounding an empty central plot, once intended for Constance herself. Instead, after her execution, her body was buried in an unmarked grave outside Louisville, denied the honor of resting among the men she betrayed in the name of mercy. The legacy of the Constance Grimsley case reached far beyond the small town of Millfield and the soldiers who fell victim to her poisons. Her trial and execution exposed deep institutional weaknesses in Civil War-era systems, showing how fragile medical oversight, disorganized military record-keeping, and lax pension administration created opportunities for exploitation. In the years that followed, reforms were enacted to ensure that multiple physicians certified deaths, that pension claims were subject to greater scrutiny, and that medical records were handled with more rigor, changes that became foundations for future military and civilian bureaucracy. Yet the most haunting lesson of the case was not bureaucratic, but human. Constance thrived, not because her methods were impossible to detect, but because no one wanted to see the truth. Her neighbors, her patients, even the town doctor, none could bring themselves to believe that someone who appeared to embody Christian charity could actually be orchestrating systematic murder. The case stands as a chilling reminder that evil often cloaks itself in compassion, exploiting society's deepest instincts for sympathy and trust. The final chapter of the Grimsley saga emerged decades later in 1923 when courthouse renovations in Louisville unearthed forgotten papers from her file. Among them was a letter she had written, but never sent, apparently addressed to her co-conspirators. In it, Constance revealed no remorse. Instead, she lamented only that her research had been interrupted before she could refine her methods further. "The work we have undertaken," she wrote, "represents an advancement in the science of medicine, even if society is not yet ready to appreciate our contributions. Future generations will understand that we were pioneers in the humane management of suffering and that our methods were more merciful than the prolonged agony that war typically inflicts on its victims." That final letter stripped away any lingering illusions about her motives. It showed a woman who saw herself not as a murderer, but as a pioneer of a twisted form of medical progress. To her, the deaths of young soldiers were experiments, and the grief of communities nothing more than collateral damage in the pursuit of her so-called science. The Constance Grimsley story endures as one of the most disturbing conspiracies in American history. It reveals how fragile human trust can be, and how easily it can be manipulated during times of chaos and crisis. It forces us to ask unsettling questions. Was every conspirator truly identified? How many others escaped justice, continuing their schemes in silence? And how many similar networks might have thrived hidden in the shadows of America's bloodiest conflict? If this story chills you, share it with someone who loves uncovering dark mysteries. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another tale of America's hidden past. In our next episode, we'll uncover yet another secret buried beneath the surface of history, one that proves again that the past is rarely as innocent as it seems.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.